Let's talk about collision, because we've been making some small things for a 3D platforming obstacle course game, but we had this issue here, and this has to do with collision. And as you might be able to tell, when I'm moving, I actually don't see this issue being a thing. It's only when I'm standing still and getting pushed around by the collision that the glitchiness happens. And that is because the character only calculates collision when it's moving, just to save on resources. We're going to fix that first, and then we're going to get into a little bit more theory and technicality on how collision works and what all you can do with it. So first things first, coming up here to our blueprint third person character, the thing that got provided to us by the template that we have used. We're going to go into event tick, which, as you recall, runs every frame that the game is active. And we're going to use this to move our character a tiny amount left and then a tiny amount right again. That way it will always be moving, and as such that kind of collision check will always be done properly. It's a little bit of a hacky way of doing things, but I personally have not found a better, more convenient way to do it. So the way we do that is we get our character movement, and last time we used set actor location to move a actor around. This time, because we're using the character movement, we're going to do something slightly different. Instead, we're going to use the move updated component node. This will take in a delta, which is just the offset from its current position where it's going to move to, and a rotation. The delta we're going to set to a very small number, something like 0.1 in the x and the y. We're going to leave the z alone. For the rotation, we're going to get the actor rotation and just plug that into there so that it always keeps the rotation it already has. And we want to make sure that sweep is set to on. When you set sweep to on, it will actually check for collision before it starts moving. So what it'll do is it'll check for your collision, which is this capsule component over here, and check if that moves over to my new location. Am I now overlapping with any other collision? Because if so, I actually can't move there. If you don't turn on sweep, it won't do that check, meaning that you will be able to do things like clipping through walls a lot easier. For this, we do need to have sweep turned on. But now we will always be moving in a diagonal line very, very slowly at a speed of 0.1 in x and y directions. So what we want to do as well is we want to copy over this component, and then immediately after we've moved into that direction, we're going to move into the negative of those same values as well. That way we won't actually be moving, but the collision will see us as if we are moving and calculate things a lot more accurately. And you will see now that when I run into this and I stop moving, we actually do get pushed around as we should be. And let's test it out with this block as well. And as you can see, it works perfectly fine now. That's a little bit about the trickiness of how collision can work in Unreal. It can be a little bit iffy to work with sometimes. Now let's talk a little bit more about how collision actually works and what we can do with it. Because if we go into our pusher blueprint and we select a cube over here, we can come down to the collision settings over on the right hand side here, and we have a handful of different options here. Number one is simulating generates hit events. There's two different events to do with collision in your actors. That being the overlap, actor begin overlap. There's also a component based version of this, and an event hit. These two are very, very similar in a lot of different ways. Because the hit event will run whenever you collide with a solid collision that has this box set to being true. It comes with a bunch of information, like which component of your actor collided with the other actor, what the other actor is, what component of that actor you collided with, and so on and so forth. They're pretty self-explanatory as to what they all do. The overlap, on the other hand, is something slightly different, because a collision can be set to either block other collisions, overlap with other collisions, or ignore other collisions. And that is done through the collision channels. So if we open up the collision preset here, which is set to block all dynamic, we'll see that we have a bunch of settings here of how this object's collision, which is a world dynamic, interacts with all the other existing collision channels. In this case, it's set to block all dynamic, so it's going to be blocking everything. And there's a bunch of different presets here that you can use, but you can also go with a custom route, meaning that on every single one of these channels, you can now say, actually, I want the camera to ignore this. And now everything that is looking for collision on the camera channel, such as this camera boom, which is part of our camera system that the template provides us with, is going to ignore any collision to do with this thing. I'm going to set the collision with pawns to being overlap. This means that it's not going to be a solid collision, so I can actually move through it. It's not going to stop me from moving through it. But instead, as long as this generate overlap event is turned on, that will then allow me to go into my event graph and here say actor begin overlap. And there we can do something. And for now, I'm just going to add a print string, and that's going to say overlap started. A print string is a very easy way to test whether or not a certain piece of your code is actually getting executed, or what a certain value is in your code for debugging purposes. It does come with this little warning here, development only. It's not meant to be used to put things on the screen for your actual game. That's what widget blueprints are for, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. And in much the same way as we have a actor begin overlap, we also have an event actor end overlap. And I'm sure that you can tell what this is going to do. This will run whenever we are overlapping with something, and then that something stops overlapping with this actor. So this will be overlap ended. Now, going into our capsule component for our character here, and going into the collision here, we can see that the collision preset is set to pawn, which means that its object type is going to be pawn, which is the thing that we changed to using the overlap collision instead. Which means what's going to happen now is when I run into this thing, it's no longer going to be pushing me around because it's not set to block pawns. Instead, it's set to overlap with pawns. And it's going to print something to the top left of my screen when I either enter or exit that overlap. So let's see if that's actually the case. I can just go over here and see this collision is still working as intended. But then when I go over to this, I can actually walk through it. And as you can see, overlap started. And when I exit, it says overlap ended. Now, that's not a very good use for what we're doing here, of course, because this thing is supposed to push us around. So we're not actually going to be doing that. So let's go back into the BP pusher here and set pawn back to blocking. And it's important to note, actually, that this code will work from either direction. So right now I have it on the BP pusher, but I can very well also put this into my third-person character here. And you can only have one begin overlap event per blueprint. So let's fix that real quick. This will still work because even though I don't have this capsule component set up to be overlapping with anything, the engine still knows that we need to overlap with these two different objects, and that overlap event gets generated anyway, and both of the involved parties can then use that in their code. But this is a rather useless example, right? Because this push-up is supposed to be pushing us around. So obviously we want to go back in here and set this back to blocking the pawn rather than overlapping with it. And we don't actually want to just print a string, and we don't need the actor and overlap here. What we're going to do instead is we're going to make a coin that we can pick up. So let's make a new actor, which we can do by right-clicking and making a new blueprint class of type actor, and we'll call this BP coin. Let's open that up and just add a simple sphere for the visualization for the time being. Now we could just set the collision for this sphere to overlap with the third-person character, and that would work great. That would be entirely a correct way of doing things. But there's actually something else that I want to show you, because we have, if we type in sphere, we have a sphere collision component. And as a matter of fact, we have multiple collision components. We have a box, the capsule, which we've already seen. That's the one that's used in the actual character blueprint, and a sphere. And these things, as you will see, have this outline to them, which is a very nice visual way of showing how big the overlapping collision will be. So let's make that just a little bit bigger than the coin itself. And then if we go down to collision, the preset for this is set to overlap all dynamic. And if we look what that means, it literally means that any object that it could be interacting with, it's going to overlap with, meaning that it's going to generate an overlap event. So let's do a little something with that, right? Let's go back to our third-person character, and for now, just add a variable that we're going to call coins. And that's going to be a integer, because it's going to count up entirely in whole numbers. And we're going to make that public for now, so that we can easily see the value going up as we play. In the event graph for the coin, though, we're going to ignore the begin play and the tick, because anything we want to do with this has to do with the overlap. And when this actor overlaps with another actor, we want to destroy the actor, and we want to destroy the self. And now we can start putting some of these inside the level. Just put a couple of them around as easily as that. And we can start picking them up, and we see them disappearing when we run into them. But you'll also note that the sweeper over here also triggers them to disappear, which is not something we want. We only want the coins to be destroyed or picked up when the player itself touches them. And that touches on something that I'm going to make an entirely separate video about soon. We've had a handful of very long, very information-dense videos to start the series off, so I'm going to compartmentalize the information a little bit more going forward. I'm just going to show you now. If you don't understand what's going on here, I will make a separate video on this very soon. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take the other actor from our event begin overlap in our coin, and we're going to cast that, and we're going to cast it to the third person character. Essentially what this is doing is it's checking whether or not the other actor is the player character in this case, and then it's creating a variable that we can use that has a reference to the player. Because from there we can see, hey, we can access the coin variable on the player from this coin. Again, if this doesn't make a lot of sense right away, don't worry about it. I'm going to make a more in-depth video explaining how this works. But we can get the value for coin, and we can simply say increment integer, and that will add a 1 to the value of that variable. And then after that, we destroy it. So now we will see we can still pick up and destroy these coins, but when this sweeper comes in contact with them, it will actually just pass right through them without destroying them at all. And if we go and select our third person character here, and we go into the details panel to see how many coins I've picked up, right now we have got this set to 3, and let's lock this so it remains visible as we continue playing. The moment I pick this up, it becomes 4, and then it becomes 5. So we have a simple coin pickup system now as well. Now, one last thing that you might want to do is you can forego this entire casting if you wanted to. It's generally better to keep the code for a specific object's purpose on that object itself. What that means is that I could add that code on the begin overlap here and test if the actor we're colliding or overlapping with is a coin, and then add the score adding functionality to this actor. That would be an entirely fine way of doing things as well. Generally, that will end up with the character having literally all the code in the game on it, and every other object really not doing too much. but it does avoid you having to use the casting if that confuses you. I want to show you one last thing to do with collisions before we end off this video, and that is making your own custom collision channels. Because maybe, for whatever reason, we want to set this to being a custom collision setup, and we want to actually just ignore everything. And we want the player to be able to see specifically this object. For that, we can make a new custom collision channel. And for that, we can go into the project settings. And if we just look under engine and then collision, we can make object channels or trace channels. We'll get into traces a little bit later, I think. For now, what we want to make is a new object channel. Note, you can only have up to 18 custom channels, including both object and trace channels. So you can have 10 and 8, or 17 and 1, or 1 and 17, or 18 and 0. But both of these together, you can only have 18 of them in total, which in general is plenty enough, because you wouldn't usually make a collision channel just for collision for one specific object. What I'm going to show you right now wouldn't really be how you make an actual game, but let's just get into it anyway. We're going to make a new object channel, and we're going to name that just something simple like coins. And the default response, so unless we set it to something else, everything is going to ignore the coins. And now you will note, when we are back in the BP third person character, we have a new collision channel here that we can set. And it's set to ignore, because everything is by default ignoring the coins. But let's change this to a custom setup and set it to coins overlapping. And now we have a situation where the coin is set to ignore literally everything, so including the pawn, which will be our player. But our player in the capsule component is set to overlap the coins. So what will actually happen here? And what will happen is that the leftmost choice that you have made is the one that's going to take priority. If we have one thing set to overlap and one thing set to ignore, it's going to ignore. If we have one thing set to block and one thing set to overlap, it's going to overlap. And then obviously if we have one thing set to blocking and the other to ignore, it's going to also ignore. Which we can demonstrate here, because when we walk into these coins, nothing happens, because the overlap event isn't getting triggered, because the coin itself is set to ignore, which takes priority. And as a quick note I thought of afterwards, the reason we're not walking through these coins is because the mesh itself also has collision set, and the collision for the mesh is set to blocking the pawn. So when we go over the sphere collision, that's ignoring us, but the moment we touch the actual mesh collision, that is then blocking us. So we do gonna make sure that the pawn here is also set to generate overlaps. And we make sure that our object type is set to the coins layer as well. And now we have control on the character basis on whether or not we want to be able to overlap with it. Because if we now set the coins on here to being ignored, it's going to not care about the fact that the coin might be thinking, oh, I want to overlap with pawns, because this pawn is saying, no, I'm entirely ignoring anything on the coin layer, which I can show off very easily here. So now still nothing is happening until I set this specific blueprint to overlapping with coins, at which point our coin collecting works again. So now we have a opportunity to create other pawns like enemy AI, which won't pick up the coins because they will be ignoring the coins channel. Only the player character itself will actually have the coins set to overlap, meaning that only the player character can now pick them up. Working with these different options in collision is a fundamental piece of creating games, because this is the way objects will interact with each other. Very rarely will you have two objects interacting with each other that don't necessarily have to do with collision. Usually when they're interacting with each other, it's either because they are bumping into each other or they are in each other's overlap collision, meaning that they need to communicate something to each other. Next time I'm going to take a little bit of extra time to dive a tiny bit deeper into what this casting node actually does and how it works and what you want to do with it. Because this is a very important next step. Now that we have actors interacting with each other through Collision, we also want to know how we can actually use information like variables or even events and functions that are on these other actors that we are interacting with. And that is where casting comes in. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page.